The bells of Ravenwood Hall were ringing when Emma Hart reached the iron gates, and every note of them landed like a stone against her chest. She had walked 11 miles since dawn with a soldier's satchel on her shoulder and a promise burning in her heart, and now the whole valley was celebrating something she did not yet understand. Ribbons hung from the gate posts. Children ran past her with sugared buns in their fists. A farmer's cart rolled by, loaded with flowers, and the driver tipped his hat to her as if the world were a kind and simple place. She caught the sleeve of a young groom hurrying toward the stables. "Please," she said, "what is the celebration? Is the Duke returned from the capital?" The boy grinned at her, proud to carry the news. "Returned and married, miss. 3 days past. The whole county is invited to drink to the health of the new Duchess." The road tilted under Emma's feet. Married. The word did not fit inside her head. It rattled there like a coin in an empty cup. She thanked the boy in a voice she did not recognize as her own, and made herself walk through the gates, because she had not crossed half the country, sleeping in barns and mending strangers' fevers for bread, to faint in a ditch within sight of his door. There had been a letter, months ago, a cold, short letter saying the Duke regretted that their attachment was ended, but the hand that wrote it was not his hand. She knew his writing the way she knew her own heartbeat, every loop and stubborn slant of it, and that letter had been written by a stranger. So she had come to hear the truth from his own mouth. That was all she wanted. One honest sentence, spoken to her face, and then she would go, and never trouble him again. The drive curved through old oaks, and then the hall rose in front of her, gray stone and 100 windows catching the afternoon light. On the wide front steps stood a crowd of tenants and servants, and at the center of them stood a woman in blue silk. She was beautiful, the way winter is beautiful, pale, polished, perfect, and cold at the center. She moved down the line of tenants with a gracious smile, offering her hand to be admired, and on that hand, catching the sun with every gesture, sat the great ring of the Duchess of Ravenwood, a dark sapphire in a bed of old gold. Emma knew that ring. She had never worn it, but she knew it, because a man with tired eyes and a bandaged shoulder had once described it to her beside a campfire, stone by stone, and had sworn on his life that it would sit on her hand and no other. Emma stood at the edge of the crowd in her travel-stained dress and watched another woman wear her promise. She should have turned around. Any sensible woman would have turned around. But Emma had no money left, no family waiting, and nowhere in the world to go. And beneath the hurt, something harder was waking in her. A stubborn instinct, sharpened by 3 years in field hospitals. Something about that letter had always been wrong. Something about this whole shining afternoon felt wrong, like a stage set built to hide a crack in the wall. So instead of walking away, she walked to the servants' entrance and asked for work. The housekeeper, Mrs. Finch, was a square, sensible woman with flour on her apron and worry in her eyes. She looked Emma up and down and asked what she could do, and Emma told the plain truth. "I was a healer with the Northern Army. I have set bones, drawn fevers, stitched wounds, and nursed men the surgeons gave up on. I am not afraid of hard work or of dying people." Mrs. Finch's face changed. She glanced over her shoulder, lowered her voice, and said, "Then heaven may have sent you. The old Duchess, His Grace's mother, is failing. 3 doctors have come from town and gone away shaking their heads. She does not eat, she barely wakes, and when she does wake, she is in pain. The new Duchess says it is simply age. But Lady Margaret was riding her mare across the East Fields not 4 months ago. 4 months. Emma tucked that number away the way she used to tuck away a soldier's symptoms. Something in her chest went very still and very alert. "I will see her," Emma said, "if the family permits it." The family, as it turned out, meant the new Duchess, because the Duke had shut himself away with his steward and his papers since the wedding, and no one dared disturb him. Emma was brought to a small morning room, and the woman in blue silk turned from the window to inspect her. Her name was Helen. Up close, she was even lovelier, and even colder, and her eyes moved over Emma's mended cuffs and dusty boots with faint amusement. "A war woman," she said, as if naming a curious insect. "How gallant! And you believe you can succeed where educated physicians have failed." "I believe I can ease her, Your Grace," Emma said. "Sometimes that is the beginning of a cure." Helen turned the great ring slowly on her finger, an idle little habit, around and around. For a moment, she seemed about to refuse. Then something calculating passed behind her eyes, some private arithmetic Emma could not read, and she smiled. Very well, tend the old woman. It will comfort my husband to know everything possible was done. Her voice put a gentle, chilling weight on the word was, as if Lady Margaret were already a portrait on a wall. You will stay in the servants' wing, Helen added. You will not wander the family floors. And you will not trouble his grace. He is a busy man, and he has no patience for strays. Emma bowed her head so that Helen could not see her eyes. Yes, your grace. Lady Margaret Blackwood lay in a great carved bed, like a sparrow lost in a snowdrift. She was thin to the point of transparency, her white hair spread on the pillow, her breathing shallow. But when Emma took her wrist to count her pulse, the old woman's eyes opened, and they were not the eyes of a dying mind. They were sharp, gray, and furious, like her son's. Well, the old Duchess whispered, you have honest hands. That is rarer in this house than you would think. Emma spent the evening doing small, careful things. She propped the pillows to ease the old woman's breathing. She spooned thin broth between her lips. She examined the row of medicine bottles on the side table, the tonics and drops the doctors had left, and she noticed, without letting her face show it, that the evening tonic had a faint, bitter smell underneath the licorice, a smell that did not belong to any strengthening syrup she knew. She said nothing. She simply set that bottle a little apart from the others in her mind. It was long past midnight when Emma finally left the sick room to fetch fresh water and willow bark from the still room below. The great house was asleep. Her candle threw soft shapes on the paneled walls as she passed along the gallery, and that was when she heard it. A voice, low, ragged, coming from behind a half-open door where firelight flickered. She should have walked past. She meant to walk past, but the voice snagged on something deep inside her, because she knew that voice. She had heard it command 1,000 men in a storm. She had heard it read poetry, badly and beautifully, beside a hospital cot. She had heard it swear a vow with her ribbon wrapped around its owner's scarred fist. Emma stopped breathing and looked through the gap in the door. It was a study, dark except for the dying fire. Maps and letters covered the desk, and slumped over them, still dressed, fast asleep in his chair, was Edward Blackwood, the War Duke, the most feared commander in the kingdom, the man whose name made hardened soldiers stand straighter, the man who had just married a woman in blue silk. And in his sleep, in a voice torn open by grief, he was whispering a name. Emma, Emma, forgive me, Emma. Over and over, soft and broken, the way a desperate man repeats a prayer. Not his wife's name, hers. The candle trembled in Emma's hand, and a drop of hot wax fell on her wrist. She made no sound, she was sure she made no sound, but soldiers who have survived long wars do not sleep like other men. Between one whisper and the next, Edward's eyes opened. For a heartbeat, he stared at the doorway without understanding, a dreaming man looking at his own dream. Then he came out of the chair so fast it crashed backward against the hearth, and all the color left his face, and the great War Duke looked at a travel-worn healer in the doorway, as if the ground had opened at his feet. You are dead, he said. His voice cracked on the words. They wrote to me. They swore it. I paid for masses for your soul. You are dead, Emma. I buried you 3 years ago. Emma's heart was slamming so hard she could feel it in her throat. Buried her. Someone had told him she was dead. In one terrible instant, the cruel letter, the silence, the wedding, all of it shifted like puzzle pieces, beginning to show a picture, and the picture was uglier than simple heartbreak. Someone had built a wall of lies between them, brick by patient brick, and someone had profited from it, and that someone was very likely asleep right now, under this very roof, with a sapphire ring on her hand. Edward took one step toward her, his hand half raised, as if afraid she would dissolve like smoke. And down the long, dark corridor behind her, sweet and clear and wide awake, came Helen's voice, calling her husband's name. The tent was on fire, and Emma Hart was running toward it. 3 years earlier, on the northern front, the field hospital at Harlow Ridge was a city of canvas and pain, and on the worst night of the autumn campaign, an enemy shell fell short and turned the officer's surgical tent into a torch. Everyone was running away from the flames. Emma ran into them because she had counted the cots that afternoon and she knew there was still a man inside. The heat hit her like a wall. Smoke turned the world orange and black. She dropped low, beneath the worst of it, and found the last cot by touch, and on it, half conscious, pinned by a fallen support beam, lay a big man in a commander's coat, with a wound in his shoulder and stubbornness in his jaw. "Leave," he rasped, when her hands found him. "That is an order." "I am not one of your soldiers," Emma said, and put her shoulder under the beam. She would never fully remember how she moved it. Fear gives strength that daylight cannot explain. The beam shifted, the man tore free, and the two of them staggered out of the collapsing tent into the mud and the blessed cold rain, just as the canvas roared up behind them like a falling sun. He was heavy, she was small. They went down together in the dirt, his blood on her hands, her heartbeat in her ears, and that was how Emma Hart met Edward Blackwood, though she would not learn his full name for another week. He should have died that week. The surgeon said so, twice, in low voices outside the recovery tent. The wound in his shoulder turned angry. Fever climbed through him like fire through dry grass, and the great commander, who had never lost a battle, lay shivering under thin blankets, losing this one. The other healers were stretched across 200 beds. Emma took him as hers. She fought for him, the way she fought for every soldier, but honesty made her admit, even then, that she stayed by his cot longer than duty asked. She changed his dressings every 3 hours. She packed the wound with honey and bruised garlic when the medicine chest ran empty. She bathed his burning face with cool water through the worst nights, and when he raved in fever about smoke and drums and men he could not save, she held his hand and talked to him about ordinary things. Her father's little shop of herbs, the crooked apple tree she climbed as a girl, the names of stars her mother had taught her before the sickness took both parents in a single gray winter. On the 5th night, the fever broke. He opened his eyes just before dawn, clear for the first time, and found her asleep, sitting upright in a hard chair with her fingers still wrapped around his. "You talk about stars," he said, his voice a ruin. "I heard you. I followed your voice back." That was the beginning. His men called him the War Duke. His father had died the winter before, making him Duke of Ravenwood, while he stood in frozen mud 400 miles from home, and he had not even paused the campaign to grieve. The soldiers told Emma stories about him while she stitched them, how he ate last, after every private had eaten, how he carried a dying drummer boy on his own back for 6 miles, how he never sent men anywhere he would not go first. They worshipped him, and they feared him, and not one of them had ever seen him smile. Emma saw him smile. It happened slowly, across the weeks of his recovery, the way ice leaves a river. She bullied him into resting when he tried to leave his cot too soon, and he discovered that being ordered about by a small determined woman with steady eyes was a completely new experience for a duke and a general, and that he liked it. He began finding excuses to come to the hospital tents even after his shoulder healed. He carried water. He held lamps during surgery without flinching. He learned, under her teaching, how to tie a proper bandage, and once she caught the most feared commander in the kingdom, sitting on a crate, gravely letting a wounded corporal beat him at cards to keep the man's mind off his shattered leg. "Your hands were made for more than war," she told him one evening, watching him splint a farrier's broken finger with surprising gentleness. "No one ever thought so before you," he said, and did not look up, because something in his voice would have shown too much. They fell in love in the margins of a war. In stolen half hours between battles, in the ration line, where he always somehow arrived when she did, on the ridge above camp, where he taught her the names of the constellations her mother had missed, and she corrected 2 he got wrong, and he laughed, really laughed, and 3 passing sergeants nearly fell over their own boots at the sound. He told her things he had never told anyone, that he hated the title, that he dreamed of the faces of the men he lost, that his mother was the only person in his old life who saw him, and not the dukedom. Emma told him she was nobody, an orphan herbalist with cracked hands, and he took those cracked hands in his and said, with a seriousness that frightened her, that she was the only thing on this whole frozen front that felt like home. On the night before the final push of the campaign, he came to her tent and asked her to sit, and he could not seem to arrange his hands, this man who arranged armies. Then he drew off the cord he wore around his neck, and on it hung his signet, and he told her about another ring, the great sapphire of Ravenwood, he said, the Duchess ring, worn by his mother and his grandmother, and 5 generations of Blackwood brides. He described it to her stone by stone in the firelight. And then Edward Blackwood, Duke of Ravenwood, commander of the Northern armies, knelt in the mud of a hospital camp before an orphan healer and asked her to wear it. "When this is over," he said, "the moment it is over, Say yes, Emma. She said yes. She was crying and laughing, and she said yes, and he pressed his lips to both her ruined, beautiful hands. She had nothing to give him in return, so she pulled the faded green ribbon from her hair, and he wound it around his fist like a treasure, and vowed he would carry it into every fight until the day he could trade it for the ring. The soldiers learned of it, because soldiers learn everything, and a strange, tender legend grew along the front line. Men swore that before every charge, in the terrible quiet moment when the whole world holds its breath, the war duke bowed his head over his sword and whispered a single name, like a sacred prayer. Not a saint's name, hers. And the men decided the name was lucky, because he kept coming back alive. And so, whispering ran through the ranks, did they? 2 weeks later, the summons came. Not from the army. From home. The war in the north was ending, the treaties were being drawn, and the affairs of Ravenwood, unmanaged for a year, were sliding toward ruin. There were tenants, debts, obligations to the crown. He had to go. Emma could not. The hospitals were fuller than ever with the wounded of the last battles, and she would not abandon 800 broken men for her own happiness, and he loved her more, not less, for refusing. 2 months? He promised her at the crossroads, holding her face in his hands like something holy. Give me 2 months to set the estate in order and prepare my mother, and I will send a carriage and half a regiment if I must. Write to me every week. Promise me. Every week, she promised. She kept the promise. Emma wrote him 47 letters over the months that followed. She wrote about the wounded who healed, and the ones who did not, about the first snow, about the stars above the emptying camp. She told him she loved him, in 47 different ways. And into the silence that answered her, she poured excuses. The roads were bad. The mails were slow. He was busy. He was ill. Anything but the truth, her sinking heart began to whisper. Then, in the spring, one letter finally came. She ran through the mud to meet the post rider. She tore it open with shaking fingers right there in the road. It was 3 sentences long. It informed Miss Hart that His Grace the Duke of Ravenwood considered their wartime attachment a regrettable error of circumstance, that it was ended, and that further correspondence was unwelcome. It was signed with his name, in handwriting that was not his. Emma stood in the road until the cold went through her boots and up into her bones. The paper said one thing, the handwriting said another, and a small, stubborn voice under all her drowning pain kept repeating, "This is not his hand. This is not his hand." What Emma could not know, standing alone in that muddy road, was what had arrived at Ravenwood Hall months before. It had come on a gray morning, a letter edged in black, carried into the Duke's study, where Edward sat surrounded by ledgers, half mad with worry, after weeks without word from the north. The letter was from the Field Hospital Administration, on what appeared to be official paper, in a fine clerk's hand. It regretted to inform His Grace that Miss Emma Hart, volunteer healer, had died of camp fever in the winter outbreak, and had been buried with others of the fallen in an unmarked common grave, the ground being frozen, and the losses many. A second page, in a different hand, claimed to be from a nursing sister, returning to His Grace a lock of brown hair and assuring him that Miss Hart had spoken of him at the end. The hair was brown, like hers. It could have belonged to anyone. The servants at Ravenwood still spoke, quietly, of that day, of the sound that came through the study door, once, like a great tree breaking, of how the Duke did not come out for 3 days, and when he did, his eyes were the eyes of the portraits in the long gallery, painted things with nothing moving behind them. He paid for masses. He drank too much for a month, then stopped all at once. He wore a faded green ribbon wound twice around his left wrist, under his cuff, and no valet dared ask about it, and he built himself back into the war duke, all iron and duty, because iron does not feel. And no one at all noticed the small things. No one noticed that the post boy who carried the Duke's private letters had a new coat that winter, paid for with gold. No one noticed the kitchen fire in the north wing burning strangely bright one evening, fed by a maid with tears on her cheeks, and a bundle of unopened letters in her apron, 47 of them, each one addressed in a woman's careful hand. The maid's name was Lucy, and she wept as she burned them, and she said, "To the empty kitchen, forgive me, I had no choice. He has my brother's debts." And in a fine house 2 counties away, a gentleman with a crooked, charming smile poured wine for a beautiful woman, and touched his glass to hers. His name was Charles Blackwood, and he was cousin to the Duke, and next in line to everything if the Duke's line failed. The woman's name was Helen Ashford, and her family had a great name and empty pockets, and she had a talent, polished like silver, for making powerful men believe she was exactly what they needed. "A grieving man," Charles said, watching the fire, "is a door left open. Walk in gently, my dear. Comfort him. Be patient. Be perfect. Be everything the dead girl was not. Get the ring on your hand and an heir in the nursery, and after that, well, after that, life is uncertain, especially for men who have been wounded in wars. And when the title passes to me, you will find me a very generous head of the family." Helen turned her wineglass by its stem and watched the light move through it, and she smiled her winter smile. It took her 2 years, not 1. The Duke was polite and dead inside, and courting a dead man takes patience. But Helen had patience the way the sea has patience. She learned his habits, his mother's tastes, the names of his fallen soldiers. She never pushed. She was simply there, lovely and calm and endlessly understanding, until the whole county murmured that his grace could hardly do better, and his failing mother longed to see him settled, and Edward, who no longer believed happiness was a thing that happened to him, finally decided that duty to his line was all that remained, and asked her, without one flicker of love, to be his duchess. The sapphire ring of Ravenwood came out of its velvet box at last. It slid onto Helen Ashford's white hand, 3 sizes too loose, and had to be fitted by a jeweler, as if the ring itself knew it was on the wrong woman. They were married on a bright morning while the bells rang across the valley, and 11 miles away, on a dusty road, a healer with a soldier's satchel walked toward those same bells, carrying 47 unanswered letters worth of stubborn hope in her chest. 3 days after the wedding, Helen stood at her new bedroom window, turning the great ring around her finger, and watched a small figure in a travel-stained dress cross the courtyard below carrying willow bark and fresh water toward the old duchess's rooms. Helen went very still. She had seen a miniature portrait once, stolen from the Duke's desk by a bribed valet, painted from his description by a camp artist. A small woman, steady eyes, brown hair. "So," Helen said softly to the glass, turning the ring around and around, "so you are the ghost." And downstairs, in a firelit study, the ghost was standing frozen in a doorway, while the man who had buried her whispered that she was dead, and a voice like sweet poison came floating down the corridor, calling his name. Emma ran. She did not decide to run. Her body decided for her, carrying her away down the dark corridor and up the servants' stair, while Helen's voice drew closer to that study door, and she did not stop until she was inside the old duchess's sick room with her back pressed against the wall and her candle shaking in her fist. Through the floor, faintly, she heard voices. His, low and flat. Hers, light and musical. A door closing, then silence. The enormous listening silence of a great house that is pretending to be asleep. Emma did not sleep at all. She sat by Lady Margaret's bed until dawn, with her mind racing like a fever pulse. He thought she was dead. Someone had sent him proof of her death, and someone had sent her that cruel forged letter, and the same wall of lies had 2 builders or 1, and either way, the timing of it all kept snagging on a single sharp hook. Who benefited? It was the first question her father had taught her about poisons, and it worked just as well for lies. When you find the symptom, child, do not ask what caused it. Ask who benefits from the cause. She was still turning that question over when the summons came at first light. Not from Helen, from him. The footman led her not to the study, but to the still room off the kitchen garden, where bunches of lavender and sage hung from the beams, and the morning light came through green old glass, and Edward Blackwood stood waiting with his back to the door, gripping the edge of the work table as if it were the rail of a sinking ship. He turned when she entered. For a long moment, neither of them managed a single word. Last night he had looked at her like a man seeing a spirit. This morning he looked worse, because he had clearly not slept either, and hope and horror were fighting openly in his face, and hope was winning, and hope was going to cost him more. "Say something," he said at last, hoarse. "Say anything. Prove I have not finally gone mad." "You got 2 constellations wrong," Emma said, on the ridge above the camp. "The hunter and the crown. You argued with me about the crown for half an hour, and you were still wrong." The air went out of him. He crossed the still room in 3 strides and then stopped himself with a wrenching effort 1 step away from her, his hands closing on empty air, because he was a married man, and they both felt that iron fact drop between them like a portcullis. "They said you died," he said. "Fever. A common grave. They sent me your hair." "I wrote you 47 letters," Emma said. "Then I got one back, 3 sentences, telling me I was a regrettable error, signed with your name. It was not your handwriting." "I never wrote to you at all," he said. "I wrote to a dead woman for a year in a book I let no one see. Emma, I never received 1 word." They laid it out between them like surgeons over a wound, date by date, letter by letter. The false death notice on official paper, the lock of brown hair, the forged farewell, the postboy, the seals, the timing, and the shape that emerged from the facts was not misfortune. Misfortune is clumsy. This was tailored. Someone had needed him grieving, and grieving men, as a charming gentleman had once observed over wine, are doors left open. "Who benefits?" Emma said quietly. Edward's face changed. She watched the commander come back into it, the man who could read a battlefield in 1 long look, and she watched him not want to see what he was reading. "My cousin Charles inherits if my line fails," he said slowly. "And my wife." His mouth struggled with the word. "My wife appeared in my life 4 months after that letter came, and never once put a foot wrong, and my mother." He stopped. "Your mother fell ill 4 months ago," Emma finished. "When did you announce the engagement?" 4 months ago," Edward said, and the still room was very quiet. He wanted to act at once. That was his nature. Storm the walls, demand answers. Emma caught his sleeve and made him think like a healer instead of a soldier. They had suspicions, and no proof. A forged letter 3 years old, with the original burned. A sick old woman, when half the county had watched 3 doctors call it natural decline. If he accused his wife of this without evidence, the law would shrug, society would call him mad with grief, and worse, far worse, whoever was doing this would simply grow careful. And careful poisoners, if poisoner there was, do not get caught. They get patient. "Then what do you want me to do?" he said, and the helplessness in his voice cracked her heart, because this man had never once in his life been helpless. "Stand at dinner and smile." "Yes," Emma said. "Exactly that. You are a commander, so command yourself. Let them believe their wall of lies is still standing. I will tend your mother, and I will watch, and I will find the proof. Because whoever is doing this has been safe so long they have stopped being careful. Safe people leave tracks." He looked at her for a long moment, this small, dusty woman ordering a duke to be patient in his own house, and something moved through his face that was almost a smile, the ghost of a ridge above a war camp. Then it went out. "You should leave," he said softly, "this morning. I will fill your purse, and you can be 50 miles away by dark, somewhere none of this can touch you. If anything happened to you a second time, Emma, it would finish me. Your mother will be gone within a month if I leave," Emma said. "I am staying, and besides," she met his eyes, "they already killed me once, and it did not take." From that morning, the war went underground, and Ravenwood Hall became a battlefield with carpets. Emma made her opening move that same day, and it was small and silent. The evening tonic with the bitter smell beneath the licorice never touched Lady Margaret's lips again. Emma poured the proper dose out of the bottle each night, so the level sank as it should, and tipped it into a sealed jar she hid behind the loose brick in the still-room chimney, and fed the old Duchess her own honest preparations instead: hawthorn and beef broth and iron-rich greens and clean water. The change was slow, then unmistakable. Within a week, Lady Margaret was sitting up. Within 2, she was eating like a field hand, and complaining about the state of the linen, and complaint, in the very old, is the sound of life coming back. Her mind sharpened day by day, and her mind was a razor. She watched Emma work, and she watched Emma watch the medicine bottles, and one evening, she took Emma's wrist in her thin fingers. "I am not a fool, child," the old woman said. "I began dying the week that woman's engagement was announced. I got better the week you arrived, and my tonic started tasting different. Now tell me the name of the game we are playing, because I intend to win it." Emma told her almost everything. Lady Margaret listened without one flicker of surprise, and at the end she said only, "I never liked her. She agrees with everything I say. No honest woman agrees with everything I say. Then she pulled a small key from the chain around her neck. The dowager's key, she said. It opens every door in this house, and everyone has forgotten I have it. When the night comes that you need it, and that night will come, it is under the third candlestick on my mantle. But Helen had also gone to war, and Helen's weapons were softer and crueler. It began as mist, a murmur in the laundry that the new healer had been dismissed from the army for theft. A footman's cousin, who had heard she practiced strange arts. Mrs. Finch defended her stoutly, and half the staff, seeing the old Duchess bloom, took Emma's side, but the other half began counting the spoons when she passed. Then the mist became rain. A silk shawl of the Duchess's was found ruined, and the maid responsible tearfully recalled that Emma had been in that corridor. A crystal scent bottle vanished. Small wrongs, none quite worth a magistrate, each one another gray brushstroke on the portrait Helen was painting. Stroke by patient stroke. The portrait of a thieving stranger, whose word would be worth nothing at all on the day it mattered. And through it all, Helen was flawless to her face. That was the truly frightening thing. She inquired after dear Lady Margaret's health with glistening eyes. She thanked Emma, hand pressed to her heart, before an audience of guests. Only twice did the mask move. Once, when the old Duchess came downstairs for dinner for the first time, leaning on Emma's arm, and Emma looked up to find Helen watching the two of them with a flat, measuring stillness, the way a chess player looks at a piece that has moved somewhere unexpected. And once in the long gallery, passing with her ladies, when Helen paused, turned the sapphire ring slowly around her finger, and said, smiling, to no one in particular, "What a pity it is that people who wander into great houses so rarely understand how easily they are swept out of them." Emma swept, and fetched, and healed, and watched. It is astonishing what a great house shows to a woman it believes is beneath notice. She noticed that the Duchess received letters that never went through the hall table like everyone else's, but came folded small, tucked under the saddle flap of a groom who rode to the Crossroads Inn every Tuesday. She noticed that Helen kept a rosewood letterbox in her private sitting room, always locked, and that she wore its little brass key on a ribbon against her skin, and that once, when Lucy the maid jostled the table it sat on, Helen went white to the lips and struck her. One sharp crack, the only unbeautiful thing Emma ever saw her do in daylight. And she noticed that Lucy, the pale, quick maid with frightened eyes, wore the look Emma had seen on young soldiers ordered to do things they could not live with. Lucy never met Emma's gaze. Lucy watched Emma constantly. Then, in the third week, Charles came to visit, and Emma understood at last what a door left open looked like when it walked and talked. Charles Blackwood arrived in a beautiful coat with a beautiful horse and a smile that worked like warm oil. He kissed Lady Margaret's hand and called her his favorite aunt, and the old woman received him with the enthusiasm of a cat receiving a bath. He clapped his cousin the Duke on the shoulder and told the dinner table twice how well marriage suited him and how the whole family had despaired of him after his tragic loss in the war years. He even sought Emma out, the invisible healer, cornering her by the terrace steps with his oiled smile to say how remarkable Lady Margaret's recovery was. Truly remarkable, quite against every expectation, and while his mouth said it, his eyes went over her like a man rereading a bill he had already paid, looking for the error. He stayed 3 days. On the second night, Emma could not sleep, and went down after midnight to the still room for chamomile, and that was when she saw the light in the orangery. The orangery lay across the dark garden, a long glass house of orange trees and shadows, and no honest errand takes anyone there at 1 a.m. Emma blew out her candle and went along the wet grass in her stocking feet with her shoes in her hand, and the cold of the ground came up through her like the cold of that muddy road 3 springs ago, and she pressed herself against the frame of the half-open orangery door, between a stone urn and the wall, and listened. 2 voices, low among the trees. The oiled voice, no longer smiling, and the musical voice, no longer sweet. "You said a month at most," Charles was saying. "That was 4 months ago. And tonight, the old woman ate 2 helpings of pheasant, and asked me pointed questions about my debts. Explain to me what is happening in this house." "The healer is what is happening," Helen said. "The dose leaves the bottle every night, and the woman gets stronger every day. Either the whole science of it is nonsense, or that little gray creature is emptying it down a drain, and there is worse. I know who she is, Charles. She is nobody. a camp nurse. She is the nobody whose hair you bought from a dead soldier's kit, Helen said, each word like a dropped icicle. She is the nobody whose letters your money burned. Emma Hart is alive, she is in this house. And yesterday I watched my husband watch her cross the courtyard, and he wore the ribbon, Charles, under his cuff. He still wears her ribbon. The silence that followed had weight. Emma stood in the dark with her heart trying to break out of her body, hearing her own resurrection discussed like an accounting problem. Then Charles spoke, and the oil was gone, and what lay underneath was the thing that oil exists to cover. Then we stopped being patient, he said. Listen to me. The old woman first, and quickly, before her recovery becomes the talk of the county. Grief is useful, we have proven that. A son mourning his mother takes no care of himself. Accidents find such men. Hunting accidents, bad oysters, a fall on the stairs, and no one is surprised, and then the title passes clean, and you are the tragic widowed duchess with your settlement, and I am the duke, and everything is as we agreed over that excellent wine. But the healer goes first of all. Before the week is out, whatever she has seen dies with her, and there is not one soul of consequence in the world who will ever ask what became of a wandering campwoman. There is one soul, Helen said dryly. He buried her once and it nearly killed him. Then he can bury her properly this time, Charles said, and have a grave to visit. Men find that comforting. Emma's body moved before wisdom could vote. One step back from the door, away from those voices, and the old floorboard of the orangery threshold, warped by 50 winters of damp, sank under her stocking heel and let out a groan like thunder in a church. The voices stopped. Who is there? Helen said, terribly pleasant, into the dark. Emma flew, along the black wall, through the wet garden, every childhood instinct screaming, and behind her, she heard the orangery door swing wide and Charles's boots come down on the gravel path, fast. She went through the kitchen garden gate, between the cold frames, in through the scullery door she had left unlatched, up the servant's stair 2 steps at a time on silent stocking feet, and she was in her narrow bed under her blanket with her muddy shoes and wet stockings bundled in the washstand cupboard, and her eyes closed and her lungs on fire when, minutes later, she heard soft steps pause outside her door, and stand there, listening, for a long, long time before moving away. Only in the morning, dressing with shaking hands, did Emma discover what the night had cost her. Her mother's silver thimble, the one keepsake of a dead woman's hands, worn always on a cord at her belt beside her scissors, was gone. The cord had snapped somewhere between the orangery and the scullery, somewhere in the dark, somewhere on the path where a man had come hunting with quick boots. And down in the bright morning orangery, among the orange trees, Helen Ashford stood, turning a small silver thimble over in her white fingers, around and around, the way she turned the ring. A thimble, she said softly. How many women in this house sew, Charles? She closed her hand over it. Fetch me the housekeeper. I believe the hall has suffered another theft, and I believe I know exactly where the stolen article will be found. They came for Emma before the breakfast bells. 2 footmen, Mrs. Finch with a face like a funeral, and behind them, gliding, the Duchess in dove gray with sorrow, arranged beautifully across her features, and a steward carrying a written complaint. A pearl brooch belonging to her grace had vanished in the night. The staff quarters would be searched, for everyone's protection, beginning, purely by chance, with the newest arrival. Emma stood in the doorway of her own small room, and watched the trap close in front of an audience. The footman lifted her thin mattress, and there, tucked into a slit in the ticking, lay a pearl brooch she had never touched, and beside it, placed with an artist's cruelty, her own mother's silver thimble, so that the searchers would believe the healer's keepsake had been hidden with the stolen goods, part of a magpie's nest of theft. It was elegant, Emma had to grant it that, even as the floor seemed to move under her. Half the house already believed the whispers Helen had spent weeks planting. Now here was proof a child could understand, and every honest servant in that corridor had watched it come out of Emma's own bed. She is a thief, Helen said, gently, sadly, to the assembly, and her eyes met Emma's over Mrs. Finch's shoulder, with one bright splinter of triumph, buried deep where only Emma could see it. And after all my dear husband's kindness, lock her in the linen room until the magistrate can be sent for, and someone must tell his grace, though it will grieve him. He has such a soft heart for strays. The linen room had one small high window, a stout door, and a lock that turned from the outside like a full stop at the end of a sentence. Emma sat down on a shelf of folded sheets in the smell of soap and lavender and made herself breathe, made herself think. Because panic is a luxury, and she had never once in her life been able to afford luxuries. The magistrate could not come before tomorrow. Whatever Charles had promised the orangery dark, before the week is out, the old woman first and the healer first of all, it would happen tonight, while she was locked here with the strongest alibi in the world. They had not silenced her. They had shelved her, neatly, in the one room in the house where she could not protect anyone. She hammered on the door until her fists ached. She called for Mrs. Finch, for the dowager, for Edward. But Edward, she learned later, had been drawn off at dawn by a convenient message about flooding at the far tenant farms, a half-day's ride each way, and Helen's own people held the corridor, and nobody came. The light in the small high window turned from morning white to afternoon gold to dusk, and Emma sat in the growing dark, counting the ways a careful person could reach an old woman's food, or fire or medicine. And then, faint and far away through the floors of the great house, she heard the dinner gong, and after a while, the sound she would hear in bad dreams for the rest of her life. A crash of silver and porcelain, a chair going over, a woman's scream, pitched perfectly, carrying beautifully, then running feet, everywhere, like rain. Emma was on her feet at the door, with her heart in her throat, when the running feet came down her own corridor, and the key rattled and the door flew open. It was not a footman. It was Lady Margaret Blackwood in her shawl, breathing hard, her dowager's key in her shaking hand, and one look at the old woman's face told Emma everything before a word was said. "Not me, child," Lady Margaret said. "They have changed the target. It is Edward. He came home at dinner, drank one glass of the spiced wine, and dropped like a shot bird. She has sent for her own doctor, the one who dosed me for 4 months. And she is telling everyone the wine was a gift bottle, and the thieving healer had the run of the pantry for weeks. They are going to let my son die tonight, Emma, and hang you for it in the spring, and I am the only person left in this house with a key." Emma ran, down the back stair, through corridors sliding past like water. Behind her, the old Duchess followed, as fast as old legs would carry her. And ahead, the noise of the house grew. Servants clustered outside the great bedchamber, Helen's voice inside performing grief for an audience. Emma went through them all like a needle through cloth, and the crowd was too shocked to stop the thief from the linen room, and then she was through the door, and the whole world narrowed to the bed. Edward lay gray against the pillows, and Emma had knelt over hundreds of men, and this was the only time in her life her hands trembled. His skin was cold and damp, his breathing dragged, and his pulse, when she pressed 2 fingers under his jaw, was the thing that told her the truth. A slow, heavy, stumbling pulse, far too slow. A great drum losing its rhythm, not settling like sleep, slowing like a clock winding down. Foxglove. She would have staked her life on it, and she was about to stake his. Beautiful purple towers of it grew all along the south garden wall, and a distillation of its leaves in spiced wine would taste of nothing but spice, and it did not stop a heart quickly. It leaned on it, glass by glass, hour by hour, over a whole long night, while a bought doctor murmured about strain and shock and let it happen. The bought doctor was already there, a soft, damp-handed man unpacking his case with tremendous slowness. Emma looked at what he was laying out and felt ice slide down her spine. A sedative draft. Exactly the wrong thing. A polite way to make sure the slowing heart slept its way to a stop. "Rest is what his grace requires," the doctor was intoning. "Perfect quiet and rest." "He requires nothing of the kind," Emma said, and pushed his case shut. What followed, the servants at Ravenwood would retell for 30 years. How the disgraced healer in her plain dress stood at the head of the great bed, like a soldier holding a bridge, and defied the Duchess of Ravenwood to her painted face. How Helen, magnificent, wept that the poisoner had come to finish her work, and ordered the footman to drag her out. How not one man moved, because the old Duchess stood in the doorway in her shawl, like a gray ghost of the house itself, and said, in a voice no one had heard in years, the voice that had ruled this hall for 4 decades, "Touch that girl, and every one of you will be turned out on the road by morning. I am not dead yet, and until my son can speak for himself, I speak for the Blackwoods, not she." And the room obeyed, because the house knew In its old bones, whom it belonged to. The doctor blustered about credentials. Lady Margaret had him escorted to the library and locked in with the encyclopedias. Helen did not bluster. Helen went silent and still by the window, watching. And her stillness was more frightening than any storm. But there was nothing she could do in front of 40 witnesses, except be beautifully worried, and they both knew it. And Emma turned her back on her and went to work. She fought all night. She got salted water into him, and cleared what poison had not yet taken hold. Ugly necessary work she did with her own hands. She burned through the kitchen's charcoal, ground fine and stirred into water, dose after dose, to bind what remained. She propped him high to ease the laboring heart, kept the room cool when the doctor's orders had been hot fires and sealed windows, brewed strong bitter coffee, and spooned it between his lips, a sip at a time, a small whip to a flagging drum. And between doses she held his wrist, and counted, all night long, the way other people pray. He surfaced twice before dawn. The first time, his eyes found her without surprise, as if 3 years and 1 wedding had never happened, and he said, quite clearly, the stars are wrong tonight, and went under again. The second time, he could not seem to see her at all, and his hand searched the coverlet, and his cracked voice whispered her name. Emma, Emma, stay. Not once. Over and over, soft and worn as a rosary, a name whispered like a sacred prayer. And in the doorway, where she had stationed herself as the picture of the devoted wife, Helen heard it, every repetition. The servants along the corridor heard it too, and heard, if they were honest, whose name it was not. And for one unguarded moment, Helen's lovely face came apart, and underneath was something that had never loved him and still could not bear it, a pride bleeding from a wound it refused to admit. She turned the sapphire ring around her finger, around and around, faster and faster, and Emma, glancing up from her counting, saw the mask slip at last, and understood that whatever came next had just been moved closer. By the second night the pulse had steadied. By the third, Edward slept a true sleep, breathing slow and deep, the gray gone from his skin, and Lady Margaret finally wept, furiously, in the way of women who consider weeping a personal defeat, and Emma, released at last from counting, took a candle down to the small pantry off the kitchens where the gift bottle of spiced wine had been kept, because saving him had been the first half of the battle, and proof was the second, and she meant to win them both. The bottle itself was gone, of course, spirited away and no doubt broken in a ditch, but the cup he had drunk from stood forgotten among the seized dinner things, and in the bottom of it, under the wine stain, lay a fine greenish sediment that no vintner ever put in any bottle. Emma was folding it, cup and all, into a cloth when she heard the smallest sound behind her, cloth on stone, and turned to find Lucy in the doorway with a candle, white as paper, twisting her apron in both hands. For a moment, they only looked at each other, the healer and the frightened maid who watched her constantly and never met her eyes. Then Lucy's face broke like river ice. "I cannot do it any more," Lucy whispered. "I have not slept since the night his grace fell. Miss, I have to tell someone, or I will walk into the mill pond. I swear I will." It came out of her in pieces, in that cold pantry, by one candle, the whole machine laid bare. Her brother's gambling debts, bought up by Mr. Charles 3 years ago, and the first small favor asked, "Just letters, miss. Only letters, no harm. And how there is never only letters. 47 of them, carried to the kitchen fire instead of the post bag, and she had burned them, and God forgive her, she had read 2 first and cried all night. The clerk in town who wrote the beautiful official death notice, Charles standing over him laughing about the lock of hair. The farewell letter to the camp in the north, dictated by Helen herself, word by word, while she chose the phrases the way other women choose ribbons. Regrettable error. She liked that one. She said it twice. And these 4 months passed, the drops for the old lady's tonic, brought each week from the Crossroads Inn, and lately, the little green bottle Lucy had been made to fetch from the same place, and had handed over, and had told herself was for the garden, for the rats, for anything, until the night the Duke's chair went over at dinner, and she stopped being able to lie to the only person left, herself. "And there is worse," Lucy said, barely breathing now. "They know he is recovering. I heard them through the dressing room wall not 2 hours ago. Mr. Charles said the game is lost the moment His Grace can sit up and ask questions, so it must be tonight, everything tonight. And she said, then bring me what is in the box. And miss, I know what is in that rosewood box. I have known for 3 years. It is every stolen thing on paper. It is your letters that did not burn. Emma's heart stopped. What? 2 of them? Lucy said. I could not burn the last 2. They were, forgive me, they were too kind. No one had ever written me a letter like that in my life, and I could not put them in the fire. So I told her they were all destroyed, and I kept 2 back, and when I got too frightened to keep them in my room, I slid them to the bottom of her own rosewood box one day when she left it open, because I thought, she will never look for them in her own keeping. They are there now, miss, under everything. Proof in her own locked box, in your own hand, with the dates on them, and beside them the letters from Mr. Charles she was too proud to burn, because she keeps every power she has ever held over anyone. That box is the whole story, and tonight she means to feed it to the fire. Emma stood in the candlelight with the poisoned cup wrapped in cloth under her arm, and the shape of the next hour assembling itself in her mind with terrible clarity. Wake Mrs. Finch. Wake the dowager. Send the fastest groom for the magistrate at Marley Cross. Get Lucy in front of witnesses saying what she had just said. And above all, before anything, before breath itself, reach that rosewood box before the fire did. Go to Mrs. Finch's room and stay there, Emma told Lucy, pressing the candle into her hands. Wake her, tell her everything, and do not open the door to any voice but mine or the old Duchess's. You are not walking into any mill pond. You are going to stand up in the daylight and be believed. Then Emma went up the dark back stair alone, fast and silent on stocking feet, one more time, along the sleeping corridor toward the Duchess's private sitting room, where a line of firelight showed under the door. She eased it open. The room was empty. The fire was built high, waiting, and on the small table beside it sat the rosewood box, unlocked, open, its ribboned bundles tumbled, as if someone had been interrupted in the act of choosing what to destroy first, and on top of everything, in faded ink, in her own careful hand, lay a letter addressed to Commander Edward Blackwood, Northern Front. Emma had it in her fingers when the door clicked shut behind her. She turned. Helen stood against the closed door in the firelight, still dressed, perfectly calm, and the little pistol in her white hand was aimed at Emma's heart, and it did not shake at all. I find, Helen said pleasantly, that I have been careless twice in my life. Once with letters, once with a maid. She held out her free hand, and the great sapphire caught the firelight. Now give me back my property, ghost, before I make you one in earnest. The pistol did not waver, and Emma made herself stand very still and think past it, past the small black eye of the barrel, the way she had learned to think past screaming in field hospitals. Panic kills faster than anything a hand can hold. Those had been her father's words, and she gathered them around herself now like a coat. You will not fire that, Emma said, and was amazed at how level her own voice came out. Not because you lack the will, because a shot at 2 in the morning wakes 40 servants, and 40 servants means 40 witnesses, and you have spent 3 years making sure there are never any witnesses. You are careful, Your Grace. It is the only true thing about you. Something flickered behind Helen's lovely eyes, annoyance, and beneath the annoyance, for the first time, calculation that was not perfectly smooth. Then keep your voice down, she said softly, and slide the letter across the table, and perhaps the careful thing will be for the thieving healer to be found gone in the morning, fled from justice, never seen again. Roads are dangerous for women alone. Everyone says so. Emma did not move. Every second was a coin, and she meant to spend them all, because Lucy was awake in Mrs. Finch's room, and the dowager's fastest groom might already be pounding through the dark toward Marley Cross, and time was the one weapon in this house that Helen did not own. So Emma held the letter against her chest and asked the question she truly wanted answered, the one that had walked beside her for 3 years. Why, she said. You had beauty, name, 100 easier men. He never pretended to love you. Why build all this out of lies just to be cold beside a cold man? She should not have asked it. Or perhaps it was the only right thing she could have asked, because vanity opens locked doors that fear keeps shut, and Helen had been performing to servants and county gossips for so long that the chance to be admired by an equal, one clever woman to another, before removing her from the board, was a wine she could not refuse. She came a step closer. the firelight sliding on the sapphire, and she smiled the winter smile. Love, she said, is an income other women live on. I required capital. Do you know what my great name was worth the year I met Charles Blackwood? Debts, mortgaged land, and a father drinking the last of it. Charles offered a partnership. He needed a patient woman to manage a grieving duke, and I have managed men since I was 15. The plan was clean. A wedding, an heir, a decent interval, and then Ravenwood passes to Charles, and the poor widowed duchess keeps her settlement and her freedom, and no one weeps very long for a cold man, believe me. It would all have gone perfectly if a common camp nurse had possessed the good manners to stay dead. There it was, spoken aloud in her own voice by her own choice, and Emma, whose whole body was one held breath, said the next thing very carefully, like a surgeon taking the last stitch. And Edward, she said, he stood in a church and gave you his name before God. Whatever else is false, that was real. You are his wife. Helen laughed. It was low and genuinely amused, and it was the most honest sound Emma had ever heard from her, and it made the hair rise on Emma's arms. Am I? Helen said. The door behind her opened. He was leaning on the frame because his legs would not yet fully hold him, gray-faced, in a dressing gown, 3 days risen from a poisoned bed, and behind him in the corridor stood Mrs. Finch with a lamp, and Lucy, shaking but upright, and Lady Margaret with her chin like a ship's prow, and 2 footmen, whose faces said they had heard enough on the way up the stairs to last them a lifetime. Edward Blackwood filled the doorway of his wife's sitting room and looked at the pistol in her hand, aimed at the heart of the woman he had mourned, and when he spoke, the room understood why hardened soldiers went pale at his voice. Am I, he repeated, very quietly. Finish the sentence, Helen. For a breath, everything hung. Emma watched Helen's mind race behind her beautiful stillness, watched her weigh the pistol, the witnesses, the doors, and select. From her drawer of masks, the injured wife, the swoon, the tears, watched her actually begin it, her Grace's hand trembling now on cue. Husband, thank God. This woman broke in, and I was frightened. It might even have bought her an hour, except that the night had one more visitor. Boots on the stair, fast and heavy, and Charles Blackwood pushed into the doorway with mud on his coat and ruin on his face, because he had been in the stable yard when the dowager's groom galloped out, and he had caught the boy's direction shouted to the gatekeeper, Marley Cross, the magistrate's house. And Charles had done in that instant what men of his kind always do when the bridge starts burning. He came to save himself, and he did it the only way left, with the truth, thrown like furniture from a sinking ship. It was her, Charles said, loudly, before anyone else could shape a word. All of it, cousin. I swear on our name. The letters, the old woman's tonic, the wine, her doing, her design. I only ever. And then his eyes found the open rosewood box on the table, the ribboned bundles of his own letters in his own hand that Helen had kept, every power she had ever held over anyone, and the sentence died in his throat, and the room watched a partnership of 3 years turn to ash in 3 seconds. You spineless little clerk, Helen said to him, almost wonderingly, and the pistol swung away from Emma toward Charles. And that was the mistake, the single unguarded heartbeat, and the person who ended it was nobody's soldier. It was Mrs. Finch, respectable, square, 51 years old, who had raised 6 younger brothers and had once knocked a drunken groom cold with a warming pan, and who now simply stepped in and brought the heavy lamp base down on Helen's forearm, not cruelly, just decisively, the way you crack an egg. The pistol clattered across the floorboards and spun to rest against the hearth fender, unfired, and one of the footmen put his boot on it, and it was over. All of it, over, in the time it takes a clock to tick. Not quite over, said Charles, panting against the wall as the second footman pinned his arms, because his coin had one more face and he flipped it. You want to hang me alone, madam? Then hear the rest. Ask her about Mr. Gray. The name went through Helen like a blade. Every drop of performance left her face at last, and what remained, cornered by the fire, cradling her arm, was almost pitiable. Almost. And Charles laughed, high and ragged, and spent his last coin in front of them all. Arthur Gray, he said, a gaming house man in the North Country. She married him at 19, in a border chapel, when she thought his tables would restore her family, and when they did not, she left him. But he is alive, cousin. Alive and drinking in a town I can name, and I have the parish record copied and paid for, because I never once in my life trusted a partner without holding a rope around her. She could not lawfully marry you or any man. Her vows in your church were worth exactly nothing. Your marriage does not exist. It never existed. The Duchess of Ravenwood, he said, with a bow that was the last elegant gesture of his ruined life, has a husband, and you were never him. No one moved. The fire cracked, and every eye in that room went, without meaning to Helen's white hand, to the great sapphire of Ravenwood, glowing on a finger it had never had any right to touch, and Helen followed their eyes, and looked down at the ring, and something in her finally finished breaking. She pulled it off, slowly, and set it on the table beside the rosewood box with a small click that sounded, in that silence, louder than the pistol ever could have, and she said, to no one, in a voice from very far away, it was always loose. It never once fit. The magistrate, Mr. Grant, arrived from Marley Cross at first light, with 2 constables and a face full of storm. What followed filled the county's talk for a decade, though it filled the official record with dry, quiet sentences. The greenish sediment in the seized cup, matched by a chemist in town, to the leaves of the purple foxglove on the south wall. The little green bottle from the Crossroads Inn, and the innkeeper, who kept accounts and loyalties in the same careful ledger, naming his best customer. Lucy's confession, given in daylight, standing up, believed, with Mrs. Finch on one side of her, and the dowager on the other like gateposts. The rosewood box, itself, entire, its ribboned bundles, read into the record, one by one. Charles's letters, in Charles's hand, planning a courtship, like a campaign, and a mourning, like a harvest. The copied parish record of a border chapel, 19 years old, Arthur Gray and Helen Ashford, witnessed and signed. And at the bottom of everything, in faded ink, 2 letters from a field hospital in the north, in a woman's careful hand, full of stars and stubborn hope, letters written to a living man about a living love that every other paper in the box had been built to bury. Charles Blackwood and Helen Ashford, called Gray, left Ravenwood in the magistrate's coach as the sun rose. The whole staff stood silent in the courtyard to watch, not jeering, just witnessing, which is worse. Charles talked the entire way to the gates, bargaining with the air. Helen said nothing at all, and looked at no one, except once, at the last, when she turned her head and found Emma at the foot of the steps, and the 2 women held each other's eyes for a moment across the gravel, the ghost and the counterfeit, and Helen gave a very small nod, the nod one gives an opponent across a finished board, and then the coach door shut, and Ravenwood Hall was clean. The courts, in their season, did their work. The letters and the ledger and the parish record left nothing to argue. Charles's line of inheritance was struck through by his own conviction. The bought doctor lost his license and fled the county ahead of his creditors. Lucy, who had expected chains, received instead the mercy she had earned by daylight courage, a discharged debt, her testimony weighed in her favor, and a place found for her near her sister in the South with honest wages, and she wept harder over that than she had over any threat in 3 years. As for the marriage that had filled the valley with bells, the church examined the parish record and the living, drinking Mr. Gray, and declared what Charles had shouted by firelight. There had never been a marriage at all. The register was amended. The law, which had been used as a wall between 2 people for 3 years, quietly took itself apart. Healing took longer, because it always does. Edward's poisoned heart mended in weeks, but the other kind of mending happened slowly, through a spring and into a summer, in a house learning to breathe again. Emma stayed, because Lady Margaret flatly refused to release her, inventing symptoms with shameless creativity whenever the subject of leaving arose. And the 2 of them, Edward and Emma, learned each other again, not in stolen wartime half-hours now, but in ordinary daylight. They walked the east fields. They argued about constellations on the terrace, and he was still wrong about the crown, and he still would not admit it. He told her about the year he had grieved her, haltingly, once, all the way through, and she held his hand through it, the way she had once held it through fever. And one evening by the library fire he unwound at last the faded green ribbon from his left wrist, 3 years of it, worn soft as cloth ash, and laid it in her open palm, and said, I promised I would carry it until I could trade it for the ring, and could not say anything further for some time, and did not need to. He did not ask her by the fire. He was, his mother observed, his father's son, incapable of doing a private thing when a proper thing was possible. He asked her on midsummer morning, in the great hall, in front of the entire assembled household, Mrs. Finch and the footmen and the grooms and the gardeners, and Lady Margaret seated in the center like a queen, at a coronation she had personally arranged. The War Duke, the man who had never knelt to any power in the kingdom, went down on one knee on his own stone floor before a healer in a plain dress, and opened a small velvet box, and the great sapphire of Ravenwood caught the morning light. It was made loose again, he said, to its true size. It has only ever fit one hand, Emma. It has been waiting 3 years to say so. They were married in the village church in the first week of autumn, when the valley was gold. It was nothing like the wedding that had rung the bells before it. No county grandees, no silk mountains, no performance. The pews held servants and tenants, and, in a solid weathered block along the north aisle, 30 men of the old northern regiments, who had traveled from 5 counties, when the word went along the soldiers' grapevine, men with scars and Sunday coats, some of them alive because of her hands, all of them alive, they would tell you themselves, because of a name their commander used to whisper before every charge, a name the whole front line had come to trust like a lucky star. Emma walked up the aisle with autumn light in the windows, and her mother's silver thimble, returned to her by the court and polished bright, hanging from her wrist, on a new cord, beside a faded green ribbon. Edward stood waiting at the altar rail, and the iron was gone from his face, all of it, and the men of the North swore afterward that they had finally, after all these years, seen the War Duke afraid, right up until her hand reached his. The old priest asked him for his vow, and Edward Blackwood, who had said her name 10,000 times into gunsmoke and fever, and the dark of an empty house, said it once more, in the quiet, with the whole valley listening. He whispered it, they said afterward, the same way as always, like something sacred, like a prayer. Only this time, the prayer was answered. She was standing right there, her hand in his, wearing his ring in the sunlight, and she whispered his name right back.